In a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, life moved at a leisurely pace. The streets were lined with charming old houses, each with its own story, though many of them were slowly succumbing to the passage of time. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. But in the quiet corners of this town, there were lives lived in solitude, unnoticed by the bustling world outside. It was John Miles's job to notice them. John Miles was a man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair that was always neatly combed. He wore simple, modest clothing, a well-worn tweed jacket and a pair of polished shoes that clicked softly on the pavement as he walked. His demeanor was one of quiet reserve. He moved with a sense of purpose, but never in a hurry. He had lived in this town all his life, but few could say they truly knew him. John wasn't the kind of person who sought out conversation or company. He preferred the silence, the solitude. John worked for the town's social services department, a job that suited him well. His task was unique and often overlooked. He arranged funerals for those who had passed away without anyone to mourn them. The people he cared for in death had no family, no friends, no one to claim their bodies. To the world, they were invisible. But to John, they were not. Every morning, John arrived at his small, dimly lit office in the town hall. The room was filled with neatly stacked files, each one representing a life that had quietly faded away. A large wooden desk, worn smooth by years of use, dominated the center of the room. On it sat a typewriter. John was one of the few who still preferred it over a computer. The rhythmic clack of its keys was a comforting sound, a steady beat in the otherwise silent office. John's routine was meticulous. He would start his day by going through the reports that came in from the local hospital, the police, and sometimes the coroner. These reports listed the names of those who had died alone, along with whatever little information could be found about them. It wasn't much: a date of birth, a last known address, maybe a brief note about their occupation, or a mention of a distant relative who was long out of touch. John would carefully file each report and then begin his research. He would visit the last known addresses, talk to neighbors, and search through old records. Most of the time he found very little, sometimes nothing at all. But that didn't deter him. To John, every detail mattered, no matter how small. He believed that everyone deserved to be remembered, even if only by him. In the afternoons, John would sit at his desk and write. He kept a journal, a thick leather-bound book that he had been filling for years. In it, he recorded the lives of the deceased as best as he could piece them together. He wrote about their homes, their habits, the jobs they had held, and the little quirks that made them unique. This journal was his way of honoring them, of giving them a place in the world that had forgotten them. Though John had never met the people he wrote about, he felt a connection to them. In a way, they were his companions, the only ones who truly understood his quiet existence. As he wrote, he imagined what their lives had been like, their joys, their sorrows, the moments of triumph and despair that had shaped them. Each entry in his journal was a small act of remembrance, a way to ensure that they were not completely erased from the world. Despite the somber nature of his work, John found a certain peace in it. There was a quiet dignity in caring for those who had been forgotten, in making sure that they had a proper farewell, even if no one was there to witness it. It was a job that few would want, but for John, it was a calling. The town might not have known much about John Miles, but he knew more about its inhabitants, living and dead, than anyone else. And in that knowledge, in the careful preservation of those lives, John found a purpose that made his solitary existence bearable. The files, the journal, the quiet funerals he arranged, they were all a part of the tapestry of his life, one that he wove with care and compassion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, John would close his journal for the day. He would lock his office, the click of the key echoing in the empty hallway, and step out into the cool evening air. The world around him was settling into the quiet of the night, but in John's heart there was a sense of fulfillment. He had done his part, and tomorrow he would do it again. This was the lonely job that John Miles had chosen, and in it he found his own quiet form of grace. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of John Miles's small office, casting soft stripes across the cluttered desk. The room was as quiet as ever, save for the faint hum of the town hall's ancient heating system. John's fingers hovered over the keys of his typewriter, finishing the last few lines of an entry in his journal. He paused, rereading the words he had just typed, ensuring they captured the essence of the person he had been writing about. Satisfied, he closed the journal and placed it carefully back on the shelf beside him, where it joined the many volumes that chronicled the lives of the forgotten. As he reached for the next file in his inbox, a familiar twinge of anticipation stirred within him. Every new case was a mystery, a story waiting to be uncovered. He never knew what he would find. A life of quiet contentment, a tale of unfulfilled dreams, or sometimes a tragic end. It was this sense of discovery that kept him going, even on the days when the weight of his work felt particularly heavy. The file in front of him was a thin one, marked with the name Eleanor Green. John opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the sparse details. Eleanor Green, age 78, had been found deceased in her small apartment on the outskirts of town. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, and there were no known relatives. No one had come forward to claim her body. John sighed softly. It was a common story, too common. Yet something about this case felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. The name Eleanor Green seemed vaguely familiar, but he couldn't recall where he had heard it before. Determined to find out more, he began his usual routine. John started by contacting the building manager of Eleanor's apartment. The manager, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, remembered Eleanor as a quiet, reclusive woman. She had lived in the building for nearly 30 years, but no one really knew her. She paid her rent on time, kept to herself, and rarely interacted with the other tenants. Mr. Thompson mentioned that she had once been a musician, though he wasn't sure what kind. She played the piano, I think, he said, scratching his head. Had one in her apartment, but I never heard her play. This small detail piqued John's interest. A musician, living alone in a tiny apartment for decades? It was a story that needed to be told. He decided to visit Eleanor's apartment to see what he could learn about her life. The building where Eleanor had lived was an old, weathered structure, with peeling paint and creaky floors. John climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, where her apartment was located. The hallway was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of must and age. He reached Eleanor's door and paused, taking a moment to prepare himself for what he might find inside. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cluttered space. The apartment was just as Mr. Thompson had described, quiet, unassuming, and filled with the traces of a life lived in solitude. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was worn but well kept. A few framed photographs adorned a small table by the window, their black and white images faded with time. But it was the piano that caught John's attention. It stood in the corner of the room, a beautiful, old, upright piano with ivory keys that had yellowed with age. A thick layer of dust covered the instrument, suggesting it had not been played in years. Yet there was something about its presence that seemed to speak volumes. It was clear that this piano had once been a central part of Eleanor's life. John approached the piano and gently lifted the lid, revealing the keys beneath. He pressed one softly, and a faint, muffled note sounded in the stillness. The sound was haunting, as if the piano itself was mourning the loss of its owner. John closed the lid and stood in silence for a moment, imagining Eleanor sitting here, her fingers gliding across the keys, creating music that no one ever heard. As he continued to explore the apartment, John found more clues about Eleanor's past. In a drawer filled with old sheet music, he discovered a program from a concert held decades ago. The program listed Eleanor Green as the featured pianist. She had been a performer, a talented one at that. John could almost see her on stage, her fingers dancing over the keys, her music filling the concert hall. But then, as he sifted through more of her belongings, the story took a darker turn. Tucked away in a small box were letters, carefully folded and tied with a ribbon. John hesitated for a moment, then carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were from Eleanor's son, a young man named Michael. They were filled with love and warmth, describing his life as he grew up, moved away, and started a family of his own. The last letter in the box was different. It was short, written in a shaky hand, and the tone was one of despair. Michael had died in a car accident, leaving Eleanor alone. The loss of her only child had shattered her world, and from that moment on, her life had taken a tragic turn. The music stopped, and the once vibrant pianist withdrew from the world, retreating into her apartment where she spent the remaining years of her life in quiet solitude. John felt a heavy sadness settle over him as he folded the letters and placed them back in the box. He could only imagine the depth of Eleanor's grief, the emptiness that must have filled her days after losing her son. This was more than just another case for John. Eleanor Green was someone who had experienced great love and profound loss, and her story deserved to be remembered. As he left the apartment, John knew he had to do more for Eleanor than simply arrange a funeral. He felt a deep personal connection to her, a need to ensure that her life and the music she once created would not be forgotten. This case had touched him in a way that few others had, and he was determined to uncover as much of her story as he could. Back in his office, John sat at his desk, the file on Eleanor Green open before him. He began to type, carefully recording everything he had learned about her. The story of a gifted pianist whose life was forever changed by the loss of her child. A woman who retreated into the shadows but whose music once brought light to the world. The next morning, John Miles woke with a sense of purpose that felt almost unfamiliar. Eleanor Green's story had sparked something within him, a deep curiosity that pulled him out of his usual routine and into a journey he hadn't expected. He knew there was more to learn about Eleanor, more to uncover about the life she had led before the silence had claimed her, and so he set out to find the missing pieces of her story. John's first stop was Eleanor's old apartment building. He returned there hoping to speak with some of the tenants who might have known her. The building had a few long-term residents, and John thought they might have some memories to share. As he knocked on doors, he was met with polite indifference from most, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Parker, invited him in for tea. Mrs. Parker was in her late 70s, with snow-white hair and a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She had lived in the building for over 40 years, and had seen many people come and go. As she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups, she began to reminisce about Eleanor. Eleanor was a quiet soul, Mrs. Parker said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. She kept to herself mostly, but I remember when she first moved in. She was full of life back then, always smiling. She used to play the piano. Oh, how she could play. The music would fill the whole building. We all loved listening to her. John sipped his tea, picturing Eleanor as a younger woman, bringing joy to her neighbors with her music. "Do you know what happened?" he asked gently. "Why did she stop playing?" Mrs. Parker sighed, her expression growing somber. "It was after her son died. Michael was his name. Such a handsome young man. She was never the same after that. The music stopped, and so did her smile. She just faded away. It was heartbreaking to see." John nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He thanked Mrs. Parker for her time and left the apartment with a heavy heart. He knew that grief could change a person, but hearing it firsthand made Eleanor's story all the more poignant. Next, John decided to visit the local library, a place he had learned Eleanor used to frequent in her younger days. The library was a beautiful old building with high ceilings and shelves filled with books that seemed to whisper stories of their own. As John stepped inside, the familiar scent of aging paper greeted him, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He approached the front desk, where an older librarian with kind eyes looked up from her book. Her name tag read Margaret. John introduced himself and explained why he was there. "Eleanor Green," Margaret repeated, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "I remember her well. She used to come here often, always with a new book or sheet music to borrow. She was a regular until she wasn't." "Did she ever talk about her life? About her music?" John asked. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "She was passionate about music. I remember she used to participate in local recitals and even taught piano lessons to children in the community. But after her son's death, she withdrew from everything. It was like the world lost color for her. She came in less and less, and eventually she stopped coming altogether." John could sense the sadness in Margaret's voice, a shared grief for the woman who had once been a vibrant part of the community. He thanked Margaret and asked if there were any records of Eleanor's participation in those recitals. Margaret promised to look into it and let him know if she found anything. John left the library feeling a growing sense of responsibility. Eleanor had been more than just a name on a file. She had been a talented musician, a mother, a beloved member of the community. Her life had touched many, even if only briefly. He realized that it was his duty to ensure that her memory was honored, that her life was not reduced to just another forgotten case. Determined to learn more, John decided to track down one of Eleanor's old friends. He had found a letter among Eleanor's belongings from a woman named Alice, who had lost contact with her years ago. The letter mentioned a shared history, a time when they had been close. With a little digging, John was able to find an address for Alice and made his way to her home. Alice lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. She was a spry woman in her late 60s, with sharp eyes that belied her age. When John explained his purpose, she invited him inside and offered him a seat at her kitchen table. "Eleanor and I were very close once," Alice said, her voice tinged with both fondness and regret. "We met in college, both studying music. We were inseparable, shared everything, dreams, fears, hopes for the future. She was always the better pianist, though. Her talent was something else." John listened intently as Alice spoke. She described Eleanor as a woman full of passion and promise, someone who had once dreamed of playing on grand stages. But then, life had taken its toll. Eleanor had married young, had her son, and devoted herself to her family. After Michael's death, Alice explained, Eleanor had shut herself off from everyone, including her closest friends. "I tried to reach out to her, but she pushed me away," Alice said, her voice cracking slightly. "I wish I had tried harder, but I respected her wishes. She didn't want to be reminded of what she had lost." John could see the pain in Alice's eyes, the regret of a friendship lost to the ravages of grief. He assured her that Eleanor's story would not be forgotten, that he was committed to honoring her memory. As John left Alice's home, the pieces of Eleanor's life were starting to come together. She had been a woman of immense talent and deep love, but also one who had suffered a loss so profound that it had consumed her. John felt a connection to Eleanor that went beyond his usual professional detachment. He saw in her a reflection of the loneliness he often felt in his own life. Back in his office, John sat at his desk, surrounded by the notes he had taken, the letters, the memories shared by those who had known Eleanor. He began to write, carefully crafting the story of Eleanor Green, the gifted pianist, the loving mother, the woman who had retreated into silence but who had once filled the world with music. He knew there was more to do, more to discover. But for now, John felt a sense of peace. He was determined to ensure that Eleanor's life would be remembered, that her story would be told with the respect and dignity she deserved. And in doing so, he found himself connecting not just to Eleanor, but to the community around him, to the people who had known her, and to the memories they shared. John had never been one for deep connections, but as he delved deeper into Eleanor's life, he began to understand that connection was what made life meaningful. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to seek out that connection for himself. The day of Eleanor Green's funeral dawned cold and gray, with a soft mist hanging over the town. The quiet streets, usually empty at this early hour, seemed to reflect the solemnity of the occasion. John Miles stood by the window of his office, gazing out at the overcast sky. He had spent the last few days meticulously planning the funeral, ensuring that it would be a dignified farewell for Eleanor, even if only a few people were there to witness it. John had always prided himself on his attention to detail, but this time, it felt different. This time, it was personal. He had learned so much about Eleanor's life, her joys, her sorrows, and the music that had once filled her days. He felt a deep responsibility to honor her memory, not just as part of his job, but as a way to connect with the person she had been. The small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town was the chosen resting place for Eleanor. It was a peaceful spot, nestled between tall trees that whispered in the breeze. The gravestones, some weathered and worn, stood like silent sentinels, each marking a life that had once been. John had arranged for a simple headstone for Eleanor, engraved with her name and the dates of her birth and death. Below that, he had added the words, "A life of music and love." As John arrived at the cemetery, he was relieved to see a few familiar faces. Mrs. Parker from Eleanor's apartment building was there, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Margaret, the librarian who remembered Eleanor's visits, stood quietly by the entrance, her hands clasped in front of her. And to John's surprise, Alice had come as well, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. There were a few others, neighbors perhaps, or people who had known Eleanor in passing, but it was a small group, no more than 10 in total. John greeted each person with a quiet nod, grateful for their presence. As the group gathered around the gravesite, the minister, a kind-faced man with a gentle voice, began the service. The words were simple, a reflection on the inevitability of death and the hope of peace in the afterlife. John listened, his mind filled with images of Eleanor, her fingers dancing over the piano keys, her smile as she looked down at her son, the sorrow that had weighed so heavily on her heart. When the minister finished, he looked to John, who had asked to say a few words. John wasn't one for public speaking, but he felt compelled to share what he had learned about Eleanor. He stepped forward, his hands slightly trembling as he held a small notebook containing his notes. "Thank you all for coming," John began, his voice steady but soft. Eleanor Green was a woman of great talent and deep love. She was a gifted pianist, someone who could bring music to life in a way that touched the hearts of those who heard it. She was also a mother, a role she cherished above all else. But life, as we all know, can be cruel. Eleanor suffered the loss of her son Michael, and it changed her. The music stopped, and she withdrew from the world. John paused, glancing at the faces around him. He could see the emotions in their eyes, the sadness, the empathy, the shared understanding of a life touched by both beauty and pain. But Eleanor was more than her grief, John continued. She was a person who loved deeply, who gave her all to her music and her son. And though she may have lived her later years in solitude, we are here today to remember her for who she was. A woman who lived, who loved, and who brought something special into the world. John looked down at the notebook in his hands, then closed it gently. We may be few in number today, but that doesn't diminish the importance of this moment. Eleanor's life mattered. Her music, her love, they mattered. And we are here to honor that. As John stepped back, a soft murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Mrs. Parker stepped forward, placing her bouquet of wildflowers on the casket, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Margaret followed, gently laying down a small book of sheet music she had found in the library archives, a piece Eleanor had once borrowed and loved. Alice, her face lined with regret and resolve, placed a single white rose on the casket, a final gesture of the friendship they had once shared. The group lingered for a few moments longer, each lost in their own thoughts, before slowly beginning to disperse. John remained by the gravesite, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. He felt a deep sense of closure, not just for Eleanor, but for himself as well. For the first time, he felt truly connected to the people around him, to the life he had pieced together through his work, and to the community that had come together to remember one of their own. As the last of the mourners left, John stood alone by the grave, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the small steps he had taken to uncover Eleanor's story. He had done what he could to ensure that her life was honored, that her memory would not be forgotten. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for, a sense of connection, of belonging. John took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. He knew that his work would continue, that there would be other cases, other lives to uncover and honor. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, standing by the grave of a woman who had lived a life of music and love, and who had finally found her quiet farewell. The day after Eleanor Green's funeral, John Miles sat at his desk in the small office he had occupied for so many years. The room, usually cluttered with files and papers, was now a bit more orderly, reflecting a subtle shift in John's state of mind. The sunlight streamed in through the window, casting warm patches of light on the polished wood of his desk. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of paper as John sorted through his notes. He had just finished updating Eleanor's file, carefully placing it among the others he had worked on over the years. But this time, instead of the usual sense of completion, John felt something different, an unease, a restlessness that he couldn't quite shake. He sat back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the window where the world outside seemed to be waking up to a new day. Eleanor's story had touched him deeply, in a way that no other case had. It wasn't just the sadness of her life, the tragedy of her loss. It was the realization that in many ways John had been living a life much like hers. He had always considered his solitude a part of who he was, something natural and necessary for the work he did. But now he wasn't so sure. The faces of those who had attended the funeral, Mrs. Parker, Margaret, Alice, floated in his mind. They had all been connected to Eleanor in some way, even if only briefly. And in coming together to honor her memory, they had shared something that went beyond just the ceremony. They had shared a connection, a sense of community that John had long been missing in his own life. As he sat in the quiet of his office, John began to reflect on his own isolation. He had always been content with his routine, his solitary existence. But now he saw the parallels between his life and those he cared for in death. The loneliness, the quiet, the sense of being disconnected from the world. These were not just the traits of the deceased, they were his own as well. This realization stirred something in John, a desire for change, however small. He didn't want to end up like Eleanor, remembered only after he was gone, with no real connections to the world around him. He wanted to be more than just a caretaker of the forgotten. He wanted to be a part of something, to feel the warmth of companionship, even if it was only in small, simple ways. The next day, John arrived at the town hall earlier than usual. As he walked through the empty corridors, he noticed the cleaning staff, a few fellow early risers, moving about their work. Normally, he would have passed them with a polite nod, but today he paused. He greeted them, exchanged a few words, asked about their morning. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. Later, as he worked in his office, one of his co-workers, a young woman named Sarah who handled the front desk, came by with some documents. She had always been friendly, but John had never engaged much beyond the necessary pleasantries. Today, he invited her to sit down for a moment. They talked about the weather, about a book she was reading, nothing deep, but it was more conversation than he had allowed himself in a long time. Over the next few weeks, John found himself making these small changes more often. He started taking his lunch breaks in the park across from the town hall, where he would sometimes strike up conversations with people he had seen for years, but never spoken to. He began volunteering at the local community center, helping with the after-school program for kids. It was there that he discovered a surprising joy in teaching them the basics of music, sharing the knowledge that had once meant so much to Eleanor. These small acts of reaching out began to weave themselves into the fabric of John's daily life. And as they did, he found that the walls of his solitude were slowly crumbling. The town that had once felt so distant and indifferent began to feel more like a place of belonging, a community he was a part of, not just a caretaker for. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling day at the community center, John returned to his office. The room, though still filled with the records of the dead, no longer felt like a sanctuary of loneliness. It was simply a place where he did his work that was important, but no longer the entirety of his existence. As he sat at his desk, John opened his journal, the one where he recorded the lives of those who had passed without recognition. He picked up his pen, but instead of writing about someone else's life, he began to write about his own. He wrote about the changes he was making, the connections he was forming, the small joys he was discovering in the company of others. The words flowed easily, and as he wrote, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just documenting the lives of the forgotten, he was beginning to live his own life, fully and with intention. He knew it would be a slow process, that his nature wasn't one to change overnight. But he also knew that he was on the right path, one that led toward companionship, community, and a life that was richer for the connections he was finally allowing himself to make. As the sun set outside his window, casting a warm glow over the town, John closed his journal and placed it on the shelf. He stood up, turned off the light, and left his office, stepping out into the world that was waiting for him, one that he was now ready to be a part of. And with that, John Miles walked home, feeling lighter, more connected, and more hopeful than he had in a long time. The quiet man who had once found solace in solitude was beginning to discover the quiet joy of connection, and for the first time in years, he looked forward to what tomorrow might bring.